November 29th, 1980. Duncan, British Columbia. 32-year-old Granger Taylor drives away from his family's farm in his pickup truck, but never returns. Granger had developed an obsession with UFOs, and he leaves behind a note, in which he states that he is going away on a 42-month interstellar voyage on an alien spacecraft. 5.5 years later, human bones believed to belong to Granger, as well as wreckage from his truck, are found inside a crater on a nearby mountain, and while it's believed that Granger was killed in an explosion, there are no conclusive answers about how he died. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our final Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring an odd case which supposedly has a UFO connection: the unexplained 1980 death of Granger Taylor. This story takes place in our podcast's home country of Canada, and was actually the subject of a documentary which was produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation titled Spaceman, as well as a 2-part episode of the Unsolved Mysteries podcast. Granger Taylor lived on his family's farm and was known for being an eccentric but very intelligent mechanical genius who seemingly had the ability to build or fix anything. And when Granger started developing a fascination with UFOs, he even went so far as to build his own life-size flying saucer on his property. On a very stormy night, Granger drove away in his pickup truck and disappeared, but he left behind a note for his family in which he stated that he was leaving on an alien spacecraft for what he described as a quote-unquote 42-month interstellar voyage. Well, 42 months came and went, and Granger never returned, but in 1986, some human bones and parts from a truck were found inside a large crater on a nearby mountain. Since Granger was believed to be carrying dynamite with him when he left his farm, it's been theorized that he was killed in an explosion, which may have been an accident or possibly even a staged suicide. However, since this occurred before DNA profiling became a common practice, the remains were never positively identified as belonging to Granger, so some people are skeptical about whether he actually died on that mountain, and even if he did, there are still a number of unanswered questions about what actually happened. Even if you completely discount the possibility of UFO involvement, this is still a very bizarre mystery, and I thought it would be an appropriate topic for our final Halloween episode of the year. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unexplained death of Granger Taylor. Our story begins in 1980 in Duncan, British Columbia, a logging and fishing town which is located on the southern end of Vancouver Island in the municipality of North Cowichan and has a population of just over 5,000. Our central figure is 32-year-old Granger Taylor, who lives on a 21-acre farm just outside of Duncan on the marshes of Somenos Lake. At the time Granger was born, he had 3 siblings, but his family would experience a major tragedy when Granger's father died in a drowning accident in Horn Lake. But Granger's mother, Grace, soon got remarried to a widower named Jim Taylor, who had 3 children from his previous marriage, and Grace and Jim eventually had a son of their own named Joseph, making 8 children in total between them. When he was a child, Granger developed a reputation for being a shy, soft-spoken, and eccentric individual who was known for being socially awkward, but still showed flashes of intelligence. In the 8th grade, Granger decided to drop out of school and got a job as a mechanic's assistant for one of his neighbors. But after 1 year, he decided that he had learned all of the necessary skills he needed, so he elected to quit the job and become self-employed. Indeed, Granger's mechanical skills turned out to be so exceptional that he was able to make a good living performing freelance work building and fixing things. At the age of 14, Granger was able to build a 1-cylinder car completely from scratch, and it was eventually put on display as an exhibit at the BC Forest Discovery Center. At age 17, he managed to rebuild a bulldozer which experienced mechanics had written off, and it became apparent that Granger was mechanically gifted and could take on any project. He continued to reside on the Taylor family farm, which had earned the nickname Sleepy Hollow Museum, since Granger had a propensity for discovering abandoned vehicles and parts and littering the property with them. In 1969, at age 21, Granger took on one of his biggest projects when he discovered an old locomotive in a dense forest brush about a half-mile from his farm, which had been left on an abandoned railway during the 1920s and was now covered in tree branches and moss. However, Granger disassembled the 23-ton locomotive and had it transported back to his property, and in less than 2 years, he managed to successfully rebuild and restore it. He even went to the trouble of laying out 300 feet of track on the property so that local children could have rides on the train. The locomotive was eventually purchased by the province of British Columbia and sent out on tour as an attraction before it was also put on display at the BC Forest Discovery Center. Granger's next big project involved constructing and restoring a vintage World War II-era P-40 Kitty Hawk airplane after he managed to acquire a section of fuselage, some landing gear, a partial cockpit, and an engine. Using nothing more than old photographs as a guide, Granger was able to use the items to rebuild the plane with repurposed metal signs and hot water heaters. The completed Kitty Hawk would then be displayed outside an antique store on the Trans-Canada Highway just south of Duncan. By the time he reached adulthood, Granger was 5'10" and weighed 240 pounds and became known as Gentle Ben, which was the name of a large bear who was the title character in a popular children's novel from the 1960s. The plot centered around a boy developing a friendship with Gentle Ben, and Granger earned that nickname by becoming a friend and mentor to a number of kids in the area, as he would often hire them to assist as helpers on his projects and teach them about constructing and fixing things. Granger developed a particularly close relationship with a kid named Robert Keller, who, much like Granger, had decided to drop out of school in the 8th grade. Robert would later say that he was a troubled teen who was likely on the path to winding up in jail or dead until Granger took him under his wing and recruited Robert to work on his farm with him and assist with his projects. During an interview, Robert stated, quote, "Granger was the most intelligent, down-to-earth, wise man that I've ever met in my life. He wasn't a nut. He was a very, very intelligent guy who carried on with his life normally. But after you say spaceman, then all of a sudden he becomes a nut." End quote. Indeed, by the late 1970s, Granger had developed an obsessive fascination with UFOs and aliens and collected and read every book he could find about the subject. He eventually decided to devote half a year to constructing and welding together his own life-size silver-colored replica of a flying saucer. The saucer was assembled out of a pair of satellite receiving dish he had obtained from a junkyard, as well as other spare parts, and it had an aluminum plate ramp door and was held up by metal pillars under some fir trees on his property. Granger also fitted the interior of the saucer with a television, a couch, a wood-burning stove, and a plywood sleeping ledge, so he would spend a lot of his spare time thinking and sleeping in there. Granger told people that he believed that extraterrestrial visitation was possible, but he was trying to figure out how it could be done, and he even went so far as to construct a radio inside his flying saucer, which he hoped to use to communicate with life from another planet. Well, by the fall of 1980, Granger finally informed some of his friends that he had a series of dreams in which he had been contacted by aliens who communicated with them telepathically. At one point, he asked them how their spacecrafts operated and what their propulsion source was, and they simply responded, quote, "It was magnetic." They then told Granger that they needed his expertise, so they were going to travel to Earth to pick him up and give him a guided tour of the galaxy, and he would be able to learn everything about how their technology worked. According to Granger, they did not provide him with an exact date and time they would pick him up, but they estimated it would be near the end of November and would likely occur on a night when a storm took place, as the bad weather would allow them to travel under cover of rain and conceal their ship. While Granger's friends found his behavior to be bizarre, they figured he had just experienced a series of very vivid dreams, and since he seemed genuinely excited and exhilarated by the possibility of an upcoming trip into outer space, they mostly just humored him about it. At one point, Granger even took his friends out for a night on the town, which he referred to as a going-away party. Well, on November the 28th, while his mother Grace was vacationing in Hawaii, Granger asked his stepfather Jim if they could have a serious talk. Granger told Jim that even though he wasn't his birth father, he always felt Jim had been a great parent and wanted to thank him for his support. The following day, Granger stopped by Robert Keller's place and told him, quote, "They're coming for me today." Well, later that evening, Vancouver Island was hit with one of the most violent storms they had ever experienced, as it contained strong gale winds and knocked out the electricity in several areas, and the local media would classify it as the quote-unquote storm of the century. In spite of this, Granger drove away from his farm in his 1972 Datsun pickup truck and stopped by a local diner called Bob's Grill at around 6 p.m. in order to have dinner. Granger was a regular customer there, and according to one of the employees, he was dressed in a brown knitted jack shirt, a black t-shirt, jeans, and logger boots, but he did not have a winter coat on, even though the weather was bad. After he finished eating, Granger paid his bill and told everyone in the diner that he was going into space before he left at 6:30. Shortly thereafter, Granger stopped at Robert Keller's residence again to inform him he was leaving. When Robert inquired if he could go with them, Granger said he had asked about that, but was told no because Robert wasn't invited. Granger said he was destined to do this, and told Robert that he had too much going for him on Earth, which he could not leave behind. Granger then hugged Robert before he left and drove away, but this would turn out to be the last time he was confirmed to be alive. Later that night, a couple of local residents reported hearing what sounded like a loud boom in the area, but since the storm was raging on at the time, they initially wrote the noise off as thunder. The following day, Jim Taylor discovered that Granger had left a handwritten note on his bedroom door. It read, quote, "Dear Mother and Father, I've gone away to walk aboard an alien spaceship, as reoccurring dreams assured a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the vast universe, then return. I am leaving behind all my possessions to you, as I will no longer require the use of any. Please use the instructions in my will as a guide to help. Love, Granger." End quote. On the other side of the note, Granger had also drawn a map of Waterloo Mountain, which was located about 15 kilometers southwest of the family farm. 2 days later, on December the 2nd, Grace Taylor returned from her vacation to Hawaii, but since Granger had still not resurfaced, his family contacted the North Cowichan Duncan detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, aka the RCMP, in order to report him missing. The RCMP performed an extensive search for Granger, which included helicopter scans of the densely wooded mountain areas in the region, but they were unable to turn up any signs of him or his missing Datsun pickup truck. On the surface, it did not appear that Granger had disappeared voluntarily, as just like he said in the letter, he left most of his personal possessions behind, including his wallet and driver's license, and $10,000 in his bank account remained untouched. Granger owned a large Newfoundland dog named Lady, whom he also left behind, and the winter coat which Granger normally wore for inclement weather was found inside Lady's doghouse. The only major item which appeared to be missing from the farm was a box containing several sticks of dynamite, which Granger often used for blasting tree stumps. Just like he mentioned in his farewell note, Granger left behind a will for Grace and Jim, which he had originally written out 5 months earlier in June, and it contained detailed instructions for how to distribute his possessions and take care of his dog. But he went to the trouble of scratching out the word funeral on his will, and he did the same thing with the words death and deceased, instead replacing them with the words departure and departed. Now, it was no big secret that Granger had told people he was being picked up by an alien spacecraft, and mentioned leaving on a 42-month interstellar voyage in his farewell note. However, Robert Keller claimed that Granger had told him time worked much differently in outer space and moved a lot faster on planet Earth. So even though Granger would age 42 months while he was gone, 150 years would pass on Earth before he returned. In order to drive off Vancouver Island, Granger would have been required to take a ferry, but no ferry workers recalled seeing him or his pickup truck. Indeed, investigators were left most perplexed by their inability to find the truck, and since its registration wound up expiring in 1981, and there were no reported sightings of it, the RCMP believed that the truck was no longer on the road. As you recall, the vintage Kitty Hawk warplane Granger restored had been displayed outside an antique store, but when the owner decided to sell his business, the Taylor family decided to sell the plane to an aircraft enthusiast/collector, and it eventually wound up in the Dakota Territory Air Museum in Minot, North Dakota. The Taylors wound up making $20,000 from the sale, and the money was deposited in Granger's bank account alongside the $10,000 he left behind. During the time period Granger was missing, Grace and Jim said that they left the back door of their farmhouse unlocked on the chance that Granger might return home, and they kept his bedroom exactly how he left it. Well, by the end of June 1983, the 42-month period Granger mentioned in his note had finally passed, and there was hope he might resurface. At the time, one of Granger's stepbrothers, Douglas Taylor, was working for the Canadian Coast Guard and said that on the evening of June the 29th, he sat out on the deck of his patrol boat and stared up at the night sky, hoping that he would see Granger getting brought back to Earth. But this never took place, and no trace of Granger ever turned up. In March of 1985, Jim Taylor conducted an interview with the Victoria-based newspaper The Times Colonist, and while he expressed his skepticism that Granger had left on a spaceship, he also stated, quote, "I can hardly believe Granger's off in a spaceship, but if there is a flying object out there, he's the one to find it," end quote. Well, on March the 20th, 1986, 5.5 years after Granger originally vanished, a forestry work crew thinning an area of growth discovered the wreckage of a destroyed truck near a logging road in a remote wooded area of Mount Prevost, located 6 kilometers northwest of the Taylor farm. Debris was scattered everywhere, and much of the wreckage appeared to be inside a large crater in the ground, which had a radius of a couple hundred feet. After the RCMP was notified, a pair of bone fragments were eventually found at the scene. The bones were confirmed to be human, and one of them was an upper arm bone which had a large fracture in it. A wheel which was believed to belong to the destroyed truck was embedded in a nearby tree about 60 feet from the ground, and it contained a vehicle identification number which wound up matching Granger's missing 1972 Datsun pickup truck. In addition, some clothing fragments were found in the area which supposedly resembled the fabric of a jack shirt Granger's mother had sewn for him and he was seen wearing on the night he went missing. Since residents had recalled hearing a loud boom that night and a box of dynamite was missing from the Taylor farm and never accounted for, investigators formulated a theory that Granger had driven his pickup truck onto Mount Prevost but somehow caused an explosion which blew him and his truck up. Since the truck's engine and transmission were both embedded in holes in the ground, this seemed to indicate the blasting powder had to be on top of the truck in order to blow those items downward, and this would have also allowed debris to go flying and become embedded so high up in the trees. Of course, DNA profiling was still in its infancy, so the bone fragments found on Mount Prevost could not be positively identified as belonging to Granger, and a search of the area failed to turn up the rest of his remains. However, a coroner's inquest concluded that the bones likely were Granger's, and his cause of death was an explosion caused by the dynamite. The RCMP officially closed the investigation, but while the Taylors successfully petitioned the British Columbia Supreme Court to have Granger legally declared dead, they ultimately decided not to have a funeral for him. As the years went on, Granger's story faded from the spotlight, and Grace and Jim Taylor eventually both passed away. But the case eventually caught the attention of journalist Tyler Hooper. He decided to conduct some extensive research into the story by obtaining the original police reports and speaking with some of Granger's surviving friends and family members, including Robert Keller and Granger's sister, Grace Ann Reynolds, who went by the name Gay. Gay now owned and lived on the Taylor family farm and continues to follow the tradition of keeping Granger's bedroom exactly how he left it when he disappeared. Hooper's findings were published in an article for Vice magazine in July of 2016, and the story eventually caught the attention of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who decided to produce a documentary about it as part of their CBC Docs POV series. It was titled Spaceman and co-directed by John Choi and Nicolene Alani, and was released in February of 2019. In addition to Robert Keller and Gay Reynolds, Granger's stepbrother Douglas Taylor and his half-brother Joseph Taylor agreed to be interviewed in the documentary, and there were a number of differing views shared about what actually happened to Granger. At one point, Joseph Taylor was asked to do an on-camera reading of Granger's farewell note, but stopped partway through and openly expressed his belief that Granger's death was a suicide. The documentary did explore the possibility that Granger was suffering from mental health issues, which could have caused him to experience delusions about being contacted by aliens. Granger was known for being a frequent marijuana smoker, but during the 1970s, his stepfather had hired a Danish man to help him take care of the farm, and he lived in a cabin on the property. This Danish man was also apparently an alcoholic who liked to take advantage of Granger and sponge off his money, and he also provided him with hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD and acid. This has led to speculation that if Granger took these drugs or experienced a bad acid trip, he may have convinced himself that aliens were communicating with him telepathically and were planning to pick him up for an interstellar voyage. It was also possible that when Granger drove to Mount Prevost, he blew himself up by accident when he set off the dynamite. However, some people, like Robert Keller, were skeptical that Granger was even dead at all, and held out hope that he was still alive somewhere traveling through space. Even though a box of dynamite was confirmed to be missing from Granger's farm, Robert said that he would have needed several tons worth of dynamite in order to create an explosion large enough to create a large crater in the ground which had a radius of a few hundred feet. There also appears to be a discrepancy about the color of Granger's pickup truck. According to the original police report, the truck parts found on Mount Prevost were blue, but Robert insisted that the truck had originally been brown before he and Granger repainted it pink. According to Robert, a few days before he disappeared, Granger had told him he needed to dispose of the truck because he didn't want people searching for him since he was in outer space. Robert theorized that Granger may have blown up the truck himself, but then left on the alien spacecraft without taking his own life. During the filming of Spaceman, an attempt was made to visit the location on Mount Prevost where the explosion supposedly took place, but since it occurred in such a remote wooded area and a lot of logging had taken place there over the years, the filmmakers were unable to find it. At the end of the documentary, it was revealed that a truck matching the description of Granger's truck had been spotted on Mount Prevost sometime in 2018, but changes to the logging roads made it impossible to locate. Of course, there was hope that after all these years, DNA testing could be performed on the bone fragments found on the mountain to conclusively determine if they belonged to Granger, but unfortunately, the bones have since gone missing and no one knows where they are. So after nearly 44 years, there are still divisive opinions about what actually happened to Granger Taylor, and his death continues to remain shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I first remember learning about Granger Taylor's story around 9 or 10 years ago when some posts about it started popping up on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. The details of this story were also shared on a number of blogs, but there seemed to be very few actual media sources available online aside from a handful of contemporary newspaper articles. I started to wonder if this story was actually real, and figured that even if it was, certain details, particularly the UFO elements, may have been greatly exaggerated. It seems like the big turning point occurred when Tyler Hooper decided to dig deeper into the story and published his article for Vice in 2016, as a number of people from Granger's personal life finally confirmed some of the more sensationalistic details, such as Granger's decision to build his own flying saucer, his claims that he was communicating telepathically with aliens, his farewell note about leaving on an interstellar voyage, and his mysterious presumed death in an explosion. After the Vice article was published, the story started to gain newfound attention and was soon covered by mainstream media outlets such as CBC, who eventually produced the Spaceman documentary. I previously mentioned that Granger's case was the subject of a 2-part episode on the Unsolved Mysteries podcast, and just 2 years ago, it was also profiled on an episode of Never Seen Again, a docu-series on Paramount Plus, which covers unsolved missing persons cases. I think the biggest upside to all this recent newfound interest in the story is that it has finally allowed the world to learn about Granger Taylor the person, and regardless of whether or not you believe that aliens had any involvement in his life, he was still a fascinating individual who was beloved by a lot of people. It appears that Granger was just one of those individuals who was not interested in traditional education, which is why he decided to drop out of school during the 8th grade, but he was still a very intelligent, mechanically gifted person who was capable of building and fixing things that no one else could. In fact, if you perform a search on newspapers.com, you'll find some articles that were published about Granger in 1970 and feature photographs of him standing alongside the abandoned locomotive he managed to drag out of the woods and restore. The fact that this locomotive, as well as the Kitty Hawk airplane Granger built, are still on display as exhibits in museums shows that he left quite a legacy behind. It sounds like Granger was at his happiest when he was building and restoring things, but he did have a hard time fitting in socially, and I don't believe he was ever in a serious relationship. Now, Granger did have an interest in women, as he sometimes placed personal ads in the local newspapers, which is what you sometimes had to do in order to find a partner in the pre-internet and pre-online dating era. In these ads, Granger described himself as discreet and shy, and was very honest about the fact that he wasn't the best-looking guy in the world, but while it may be a cliche to say this, it sounds like Granger had a heart of gold. Even though he might have seemed like an odd, eccentric guy on the surface, everyone who knew Granger said that he was one of the kindest people you'd ever want to meet. Even though he never had any children of his own, Granger had a particularly tight bond with them, as he would frequently take the time to mentor kids and recruit them to assist him on his projects. The person who seemed to develop the closest relationship with Granger was Robert Keller, who was also an 8th grade dropout and pretty much a juvenile delinquent with no future until Granger took him under his wing and helped him turn his life around. Since Granger's story has returned to the spotlight in recent years, it seems like Robert has become his unofficial spokesperson and done everything in his power to keep Granger's memory alive. However, Robert also seems to be the biggest proponent of the Granger is still alive and traveling through the galaxy with aliens theory, and has always openly expressed his skepticism that Granger actually died in an explosion, but it does not sound like many of Granger's family members subscribe to this belief. I mentioned earlier that during the Spaceman documentary, Granger's half-brother Joseph openly stated that he believed his death was a suicide, as Granger may have intentionally blown himself up because he just couldn't deal with the challenges of life anymore. If this is what happened, then perhaps this so-called interstellar voyage was an elaborate cover story to prevent his loved ones from knowing that he took his own life. I'm sure the idea of Granger experiencing happiness while traveling through the galaxy in an alien spacecraft is the best-case scenario for everyone involved, but we have to look at this story from a logic-based perspective to try and figure out what actually happened. Now, I have to acknowledge that even though Duncan, British Columbia is a pretty small town, it did have its fair share of UFO activity during this time period. The most notable incident took place at around 5 a.m. on New Year's Day in 1969 at the Cowichan District Hospital in Duncan, which was located only a few miles away from the Taylor farm. That morning, 4 nurses who were on duty reported seeing what they described as a bright, Saturn-shaped UFO hovering outside one of the windows about 60 feet away from the hospital. The object was floating near the children's ward and apparently had a transparent window, as the nurses described seeing what appeared to be two humanoid figures near an instrument panel before the craft flew away. Interestingly enough, just last year, in November of 2023, the Royal Canadian Mint announced that they were releasing a new collectible coin depicting the Cowichan UFO incident as part of their Canada's Unexplained Phenomena series, but this news compelled a longtime Cowichan Valley resident named Dan Hughes to come forward and claim that the whole thing was a New Year's prank orchestrated by a couple who lived in a house that bordered the hospital's property. They supposedly made a cross by taping two pieces of wood together and then attached a string to the four ends of the wood pieces before placing small lit candles near the ends. They then covered the structure with a lightweight plastic dry cleaner bag and used a hair dryer to fill up the bag with hot air before the contraption was released into the air towards the hospital. While the couple behind this alleged prank have since passed away, other witnesses have apparently corroborated Hughes' story. Be that as it may, this was always one of the more famous UFO sightings in the history of Canada, and I'm pretty sure that Granger would have heard about it, piquing his interest in the subject, and possibly turning him into a genuine believer that UFOs like to visit Duncan. Whatever the case, Granger eventually developed such a fascination in UFOs that he constructed his own flying saucer on his property, and it sounds like it pretty much became his own 1970s version of a man cave, as he would spend an ample amount of time in the saucer just hanging out and thinking, and this is where he supposedly started receiving his telepathic communications from the aliens. I have to harken back to what Granger's stepfather, Jim Taylor, said during a newspaper interview. Quote, "I can hardly believe Granger's off in a spaceship, but if there is a flying object out there, he's the one to find it." End quote. In other words, if aliens wanted to take a human on an interstellar voyage through space, it would benefit them to find someone who was mechanically gifted and had developed an interest in the topic. Well, as you probably know, just 2 years before Granger went missing, another self-admitted UFO fanatic who lived over 13,000 kilometers away wound up vanishing without a trace after an alleged encounter with a flying object. Of course, I'm referring to the unsolved disappearance of 20-year-old pilot Frederick Valentich, who disappeared while flying a Cessna 182 airplane over Bass Strait in Australia during the early evening hours of October the 21st, 1978. The story is most notable for Valentich's cryptic last words during his final radio communication, quote, "It's hovering and it's not an aircraft." After that, Valentich and his plane were never seen again, and since there were other reported eyewitness sightings of strange objects moving through the sky in the area that night, this led to speculation that Valentich may have been abducted by a UFO. I covered this story way back on episode number 45 of The Trail Went Cold, and the disappearances of Frederick Valentich and Granger Taylor stand out from your standard UFO encounters since they involve individuals going missing. Much like Granger, Valentich seemed to have a devout interest in UFOs and had openly spoken about the possibility of traveling on an alien spacecraft someday. But the part of this whole story which often gets overlooked is that Valentich had been experiencing a number of personal problems at the time of his disappearance and was in danger of losing his pilot's license. One theory which has been pushed forward is that Valentich may have become devastated over the possibility that he would no longer be allowed to fly, so he decided to stage an elaborate suicide by intentionally crashing his plane into the water. However, in order to prevent his loved ones from believing that he took his own life, Valentich shared a cryptic final radio transmission in which he fabricated a story about an object hovering over his plane in order to give off the false impression that he was abducted by a UFO. If Valentich wanted to go out with a bang and ensure he would be remembered forever, then his plan technically worked, since people are still discussing his disappearance 46 years later. If you believe that Granger Taylor's death was a suicide, you could also apply the same logic here, as he may have wanted his friends and family to believe that he was following his dreams and happily exploring the galaxy on an alien spacecraft. But before we discuss this scenario any further, let's explore the circumstances of how Granger went missing. It's equally as possible that Granger was not suicidal, but was suffering from mental health issues and legitimately believed that he was communicating with aliens and was going to be picked up by a UFO. Let's face it, mental health was just one of those subjects which people were not as open to talking about back in 1980, so while I'm sure people might have privately had some concerns about Granger, it sounds like he was such a likable guy and seemed so enthused about this possible trip into space that everyone mostly just humored him about it. It was no big secret that Granger was a frequent pot smoker, but a Danish man who was hired to work and lived on the Taylor's farm may have introduced Granger to some harder drugs such as acid or LSD. And, well, if Granger experienced a bad trip and started having hallucinations, he may have convinced himself that aliens were communicating telepathically. 1977 saw the release of Steven Spielberg's science fiction film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which became one of the biggest blockbusters of all time, and I'd say it's pretty much a given that Granger saw it and it made a big impression on him. In the film, Richard Dreyfuss's lead character, Roy Neary, has a close encounter with a UFO, and it causes him to start experiencing strange visions, which become such an obsession for him that it pretty much ruins his life, causing him to lose his job and become estranged from his family. In the end, it turns out that Neary was having visions of Devil's Tower in Wyoming, where the alien mothership eventually lands, and the whole ordeal turns out to be worth it for Neary since the aliens invite him to accompany them on an interstellar voyage. In Close Encounters, there are scenes where Neary obsessively attempts to recreate those visions of Devil's Tower to try and figure out what they mean, and you can draw some parallels between that and Granger's decision to construct his own flying saucer. If Granger was tired of living on planet Earth, perhaps the ending of Close Encounters was the ultimate fantasy for him, and he wanted to experience a similar fate to Roy Neary. Like I mentioned earlier, Robert Keller seems to be the one who is most anxious to believe that Granger left on an alien spacecraft. Granger told him that when aliens said that they were planning to pick him up, they did not initially provide an exact date and time, only that it would take place during a storm so they could use the bad weather as cover. Well, sure enough, Granger happened to leave on his so-called voyage on a night where Vancouver Island was experiencing the most violent storm they had ever seen. According to Robert, Granger had pretty much predicted this storm weeks in advance, and in the pre-internet world of 1980, Robert does not believe there's any way Granger could have known this storm was happening. That is a valid point, but on the other hand, if this was some sort of staged suicide on Granger's part, it would have been the perfect night for him to go through with it. I know that on the day before he left, Granger took some time to have a heartfelt conversation with his stepfather Jim in order to thank him for being such a good parent, as Granger had lost his birth father at a very early age. This can definitely be taken as a sign that Granger knew exactly what he was planning to do, but I also cannot overlook the fact that this occurred while his mother Grace was away in Hawaii, and this was reportedly the first vacation she had taken in a long time. Granted, if the aliens informed Granger that they were picking him up on a date when his mother was out of town, there's nothing he could do about that, but alternatively, if he was planning suicide, Granger could have made a calculated decision to go through with it while Grace wasn't there if he felt it would be too difficult to have a final heart-to-heart conversation with her. After all, Grace had already experienced the trauma of losing a husband, so Granger may have thought that she would never be able to deal with the grief of losing a child unless she believed he was out living a happy life somewhere far away from home. We know that Granger left behind a farewell note for Jim and Grace and a will in which he scratched out the word funeral and replaced the words death and deceased with departure and departed. This will was reportedly written in June of 1980, 5 months before Granger's disappearance, and as far as I can tell, long before he started telling people about leaving Earth on an alien spacecraft. This definitely indicates that Granger had been planning something for quite some time, but his will can be interpreted in a number of different ways. Perhaps Granger genuinely believed he was leaving and would be coming back at a later time, but wanted to leave instructions for what to do with his dog and his possessions in case something went wrong. Or Granger knew that he was never coming back, but was still trying to maintain the narrative that he would be away on a long trip rather than dead. Now, on the basis of his farewell note, Granger gave off the impression that he would be returning from his voyage in 42 months, which never happened. Robert has always claimed that Granger shared a different interpretation, telling him that while he would only age 42 months while traveling through space, time would move much faster on Earth, and these 42 months would equal 150 years in Earth time. Obviously, this would mean that if Granger did return to Earth, everyone who he knew would be dead, but why only share this information with Robert? Why leave a note which gives your family false hope that you will be back during their lifetime? Of course, if Granger was making the whole thing up, you have to wonder why he specifically chose a time frame of 42 months. Well, if you're familiar with Douglas Adams' iconic comedy science fiction franchise, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you'll know that one of its big jokes is that the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is 42. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy began as a franchise in the late 1970s, and while I can't be 100% certain that Granger became familiar with it before he disappeared, it definitely sounds like something he would have liked. I really have no idea why Granger said he would be gone 42 months, but since we don't know what was going through his mind at that point, trying to apply standard logic to his actions may be futile. Another detail which has caused a lot of confusion is the fact that Granger's farewell note had a hand-drawn map to nearby Waterloo Mountain on the back, but his bone fragments and the remnants of his truck were eventually found on Mount Prevost, which is in the opposite direction. So how does Waterloo Mountain fit into this whole thing? Well, during an interview about this case on the Nighttime podcast, Tyler Hooper provided a potential explanation for this when he mentioned that Granger loved to go exploring with friends and draw maps of the locations he visited, such as Waterloo Mountain. So it's possible that Granger could have drawn that map of Waterloo Mountain on a previous occasion, and when he was looking for a piece of paper to write out his farewell note, that happened to be the closest one lying around. It's possible that Waterloo Mountain has no significance to this story, but then again, the bones and the destroyed truck were not found on Mount Prevost for 5.5 years. So for all we know, perhaps Granger did travel to Waterloo Mountain at some point before he wound up at the spot where he was presumably killed. So even though Granger spoke to a number of people on the day he disappeared, as far as I can tell, he only shared his intentions about leaving on an alien spacecraft with Robert Keller. Robert even asked if he could go along, but Granger told him he was not invited and that Robert had too much going for him to leave. Again, this could be interpreted as a cryptic hint that Granger was planning to take his own life. Before he met with Robert, Granger had been seen eating dinner at Bob's Grill, but even though the weather was terrible, he did not have a winter coat on. If Granger did not bother to dress appropriately, this could be yet another sign that he was planning to leave this mortal coil, though whether it was via suicide or an alien spacecraft is still up for debate. It seems like Robert is the one who has always argued the hardest against the evidence which points towards Granger perishing on Mount Prevost. He is actually not convinced that the truck parts found on the mountain belong to Granger's 1972 Datsun pickup, and there seems to be an odd discrepancy about the truck's color. While the truck pieces on Mount Prevost appeared to be blue, Robert maintains that he helped Granger repaint his pickup in the months prior to his disappearance and described it as being quote-unquote Pepto-Bismol pink. And prior to this, the truck was supposedly brown. Well, according to Tyler Hooper, the pickup's records and insurance forms still listed as being blue, which may have been its color at the time it was originally registered. And if the truck was destroyed in a massive explosion, the heat could have been strong enough to melt away multiple layers of paint, which is why the parts that were found appear to be blue. In the aforementioned Never Seen Again episode, Granger's stepbrother Douglas seems to dispute Robert's claims that the truck was ever pink to begin with, as he said it was actually a light gray color, and the episode even puts up a title card which reads, quote, "The debate over the truck's color has not been conclusively settled." Well, regardless of what color it was, that doesn't change the fact that a wheel was found embedded in a tree containing a vehicle identification number which matched Granger's pickup, so I really think that should end the debate about whether or not his truck actually blew up on Mount Prevost. Even though it's been reported that Granger's mother, Grace, positively identified clothing fragments found in the area as being from a jack shirt she had sewn for him, Robert claimed during the Unsolved Mysteries podcast that Grace told him she never made that identification. Now, even though the RCMP are certain that Granger was killed in the explosion, I suppose we can't say that with absolute certainty, as only 2 bone fragments were found, and since they are no longer available for DNA testing, we'll never be able to confirm that those bones actually belong to him. But if they didn't, then it's one hell of a coincidence that these unrelated bones would be found in the area where Granger's truck blew up. I will admit that the disappearance of the remains is pretty odd, as it sounds like it would have been standard procedure for the coroner to turn them over to Granger's next of kin once the investigation was completed, but no one from the Taylor family has any recollection of ever having received them. A box of dynamite was definitely missing from the Taylor farm, which Granger likely took with him, but I do think Robert makes a valid point when he says you would likely need a lot more dynamite to cause an explosion that could create a crater that large. So if you legitimately believe that Granger left planet Earth with the aliens, did they use their spaceship to blow up his pickup truck? Well, Robert claims that before he left, Granger told him he would dispose of his truck in order to prevent everyone from wasting time searching for it, but this could have been another detail that Granger dropped in order to lend credence to a fabricated cover story. We know that some local residents recalled hearing a loud boom on the night Granger disappeared, which they assumed was thunder at the time, but in retrospect was likely the sound of the truck exploding on Mount Prevost. Given that there was a massive search effort for Granger, it might seem strange that it took 5.5 years before anyone found the location where this explosion took place, but it sounds like it was a very remote area of the mountain which was difficult to get to unless you were familiar with it. Remember, when the Spaceman documentary was made, the filmmakers could not even find the spot since the woods were so dense and difficult to navigate. If you believe the theory that Granger staged an elaborate suicide and tried to give everyone the false impression that he had left on an interstellar voyage, the pieces do fit together. While blowing yourself up might not seem like the most logical way to fabricate a disappearance, Granger could have elected to do so on a night where the area was experiencing the most violent thunderstorm they had ever seen. If you cause a large explosion on a calm, quiet night, there's a good chance that someone is going to be able to follow the noise and find the spot where it occurred, but on this particular night, most people were staying indoors for their own safety and just assumed the noise was thunder. We know that Granger loved to go exploring in the mountains, so if he was familiar enough with the layout of Mount Prevost, he may have found a remote spot where people rarely ever visited and chose that as the location for his suicide. If this was Granger's intention, the strategy did work for a while, since the site of the explosion remained undiscovered for years before a forestry work crew just happened to stumble upon it. And of course, so much time had elapsed that very few of Granger's remains could be found, and there was not enough evidence to conclusively determine what happened to him. Given how difficult that area is to navigate and the amount of overgrowth which has since appeared there, if the bones and the truck parts were not discovered in 1986, then it's possible they never would have been found and Granger would still be a missing person to this day. Look, I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that Granger's death was a suicide, because it's equally as plausible that he could have set off that dynamite and killed himself accidentally. Since Granger had a lot of experience with dynamite, everyone who knew him has said that he would have been careful enough not to blow up his own truck, but we really don't know what his mental state was at that time. Another theory I've seen pushed forward is that Granger convinced himself that if he caused an explosion, he would launch himself right into space to rendezvous with the UFO. All of Granger's claims about the telepathic communication with the aliens and his interstellar voyage may have been nothing more than delusions from a man who was mentally ill or under the influence of some drugs which caused him to become detached from reality. But who knows? Maybe something otherworldly did happen that night which we're never going to understand. No matter what you believe happened to Granger, I guess the silver lining about his case being brought back into the spotlight in recent years is that it's given people who greatly cared about him an outlet to talk about what a special person he was. So no matter where he might be right now, I'm sure Granger would take comfort in knowing that people are still saying glowing things about him all these years later. The investigation into this case is officially considered to be closed, but the North Cowichan Duncan detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have stated that they are willing to hear new information, so if you happen to know anything about the unexplained death of Granger Taylor, please contact the RCMP at 250-748-5522. That's 250-748-5522. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the mysterious story of John Doe number 24, a young deaf-mute man who was found wandering the streets of Illinois in 1945 and spent the next 48 years in various institutions without being identified. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a bizarre missing persons case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1998 disappearance of Leonard Derrickson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Juniper and Kimberly S. Thank you so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So we hope you all have yourselves a safe and happy Halloween and a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.